2023 City of Portland Planning Commission meeting. I am the chair, Mary Rain O'Mara. I'm joined here in person by Commissioner Lang, Commissioner Routh, Commissioner Alexander, Commissioner Patel, Commissioner Spivak, and online we have Vice Chair Pouncil and Vice Chair Thompson. And I will go ahead and ask if there are any items of interest from commissioners. Okay, we can go ahead and proceed. Do we have a director's report? Oh, my apologies. Okay, so we're actually covering the H&A letter as one of the items of interest. So want to confirm that the housing needs analysis letter, which will be going to City Council, just need to get a head nod or raising of hands for a show of support and confirmation that we are good to go to submit that to City Council. Okay. Seeing consensus around that item, and so go ahead and proceed now. Is there a director's report today, Patricia?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. I don't have any items to report today, so thank you.
Great. We'll move ahead to our consent agenda. We have consideration of the meeting minutes from the October 24th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I'm happy to motion to approve this, Commissioner Routh.
Okay, Commissioner Routh.
Second.
And second, Commissioner Lang. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. So with that, I would like to go ahead and invite up Bill Cunningham, Ryan Singer, Shane Vale with our Lower Southeast Rising Plan agenda item. We do have a work session on this item today, so welcome, and I will go ahead and hand it over to all of you to take us, kick us off here for the work session.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce our new principal planner, Ryan Singer. Ryan started on October 11th, and he very recently joined the team here. He has long time experience as a city planner in the city of New York, and he can take a moment and just introduce himself, but he's here joining this team. He supported a little bit in the preparation of this presentation, so we wanted to invite him to join this item and to meet you all. Thank you so much.
Hi, so Ryan Singer for the record, Principal Planner for Long Range Planning and Urban Design. And as Patricia said, I worked for the last 21 years for the City of New York in various capacities. And in fact, my last role was I was the Land Use Review Director, and I was responsible for the care and feeding of the New York City Planning Commission. So I am familiar with the operation of planning commissions. And prior to going to New York, though I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Walla Walla, Washington, and I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees in Seattle at the University of Washington. And I have relatives who lived in Vancouver, and so throughout my childhood, we came to Portland and did shopping and visiting relatives, and so I have very fond memories of Portland, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Ryan. Welcome. We're excited to have you joining on the BPS staff. And I neglected to actually ask a question of commissioners, and that is, do we have any items for disclosure for the first agenda item?
Not aye.
And I do need to disclose that I am a property owner in the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood. Thank you. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back over.
All right, I'm Bill Cunningham with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, joined by Shane Valley from PBOT. And we're returning from our earlier session with you on October 10th. We have information to share related to the topics that you all raised at the end of the last meeting. So we're going to run through what we have and are happy to support any discussion. Just to remind people, this is the Lower Southeast Rising Area Plan, and its core focus area is the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood, which you can see in this diagram, but it also includes adjacent neighborhood areas, including parts of the Woodstock, Mount Scott-Arleta, and Lentz neighborhoods, extending roughly from Chavez Boulevard and Holgate and the north, and Foster as well, down to the city boundary and extending east to 92nd. The project objectives are really about addressing the lack of access to services and housing choices in this area. So a key objective is expanding opportunities for neighborhood businesses in this area and expanding housing options. And then with our partnership with PBOT, a key goal is to expand active and green transportation access in the area, as well as to address community stability. Just to remind you about what staff is proposing for Planning Commission action is to adopt this report, and the key amendments are really related to mapping. There are amendments to the Comprehensive Plan Urban Design Framework, including designating a new neighborhood center, to our amendments to our Comprehensive Plan map, zoning map, and a couple zoning code maps. The topics raised by this commission, just to be clear up front as to what we'll be focusing on, related to land use included interest in prioritizing housing stability. There was a lot of interest in what are we doing related to home ownership opportunities in the area. There was also interest in understanding more about what the vision is for 72nd and Faville, which is intended to be the new neighborhood business district for the area. And there's interest in some of the rationale for our very targeted zoning changes. BES had also requested a rezoning 2 additional properties to open space, so I'll be touching on that. And then the topic was raised about what about the employment and industrial properties in either Springwater Corridor and 82nd Avenue. So there's the key land use ones, and I'll maybe let Shane chime in about what we heard about transportation.
Yeah, just quickly, we wanted to review the transportation issues that are brought up in testimony and what we're doing to address, what urgency we have to address these. Provide some more information about what those local street improvements could look like, how they relate to safe routes to school, how do they relate to the discussion about sidewalks, and then also talk about how we chose to prioritize the transportation investments and how those recommended projects relate to the broader transportation system.
All right, without further ado, we'll jump into the land use topics. And again, we want to leave a lot of room for discussion, but are happy to answer questions as we go along. Just another bit of background, this area is very predominantly, in terms of the land use and zoning, very predominantly single dwelling. About 74% of the area, you can see in yellow and orange, is zoned for single dwelling development. Multi-dwelling development, shown in the blue, is another 10%. Just a pretty small amount of commercial zoning, the red and pink areas, you can see it in Woodstock, and very little of that in the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood. And there's also industrial and employment zoning, especially along 82nd. To remind you as to the major moves proposed by this plan, there's a proposed neighborhood center in the vicinity of 72nd and Faville and extending to 82nd. That's really intended to be a hub for services in the area and an opportunity for additional housing opportunity. Also, there are also proposals for small commercial areas at other intersections, and one of the main concepts is expanding options on the major corridors such as 52nd and 72nd for housing opportunities, along with improved transportation and transit access. I wanted to say a bit about community stabilization and what our analysis is showing related to any impacts on housing stability and displacement in the area. A key thing we wanted to remind you about is the zone changes avoided existing unregulated low-cost apartments as well as manufactured home parks. Didn't want to add to the development pressures on that important housing resource in the area. Another thing that really came out in our economic analysis was that most of the zone changes from single dwelling zoning are to low-rise multi-dwelling zoning, especially RM1. And the analysis was really finding that that shift was not anticipated to cause any greater displacement. What's already allowed in the single dwelling zones, such as townhouses that are allowed by RIP, are at this point the most economically attractive development type. So shifting to allow some increment of additional housing opportunity isn't expected to really change that equation. Another thing to be aware of in this area is that if there were interest in constraining that multi-dwelling zoning proposals, constraining housing options is something that could actually, in the long term, impact stability of the community in that area. If there's too much of a constraint on housing possibilities, that could have an impact on the market in terms of raising housing costs. Also wanted to touch a bit about the proposals and how they relate specifically to home ownership opportunities. As I mentioned before, the plan area zoning is very predominantly single dwelling. It's about 74%. And with the zone changes, that would go to 71% would remain single dwelling zoning. So this is not really changing that equation about home ownership opportunities in single dwelling zones. It's mostly remaining the same. And as I'd mentioned before, townhouses are a very feasible development type in the RM1 zone, which is the primary zone that's shifting away from single dwelling zones. And really on the small sites that predominate in this area, townhouses are right now the market choice. And townhouses are a very common homeownership opportunity. It tends to be the larger sites where you see more apartment type development in the low-rise multi-dwelling zonings. There was testimony raised about what about tax incentives we have for home ownership housing. And we took a closer look at those tax incentives, also known as HOLTE, and they apply to houses, townhouses, and condominiums with 3+ bedrooms, and all of those are built in the multi-dwelling zones. So the relatively modest shift to low-rise multi-dwelling is not something we see as shifting opportunities away from ownership housing. Wanted to share this slide. This shows in the colored areas the areas in the plan that are proposed for zone changes. And the zone changes, they're very targeted to the center and the corridors, and they amount to 6.7% of the plan area. And this map is showing in yellow the areas that are shifting from single dwelling zoning mostly to low-rise multi-dwelling zoning. And so you can see they're primarily on corridors such as 52nd and 72nd, as well as within the proposed neighborhood center intended to really boost opportunities for housing close to services. One area that was brought up in testimony and really was the majority of people concerned about the zone changes is what I'm calling the Malden Street area. And this is just south of Flavelle between 72nd and 82nd. And this area, which is shown in the dashed lines, it's proposed from a zone change from R2.5 townhouse zoning to the small scale RM1 multi-dwelling zone. It is within that proposed neighborhood center. It's located, as I mentioned, between 72nd and 82nd, so close to those commercial hubs, close to Whitman Elementary and a park that's right there as well. And one thing we had heard in some of our community discussions was that we should not restrict multi-dwelling zoning primarily to the big busy corridors like 82nd. We should provide more opportunities for multi-unit housing off of the major corridors. And this would be an example of a move that would accomplish that in a location close to services. One thing I want to highlight too is that RM1 zoning is already mapped in this area, and actually it highlights, it's better highlighted in this map showing on the left the current zoning and the proposed zoning on the right. You can see that north of Flavelle, it's already RM1 zoned, and what the proposal is to also apply RM1 zoning to the area south of Flavelle, between Flavelle and Lambert. wanted to highlight some of the differences between the RM1 zone and R2.5 zone. Some of the testimony was really concerned about hulking apartment buildings adjacent to single dwelling housing. These zones are actually fairly similar. The RM1 multi-dwelling zones intended to be pretty compatible with established single dwelling areas. Same building height, it's sort of a 2 to 3 stories scale, almost the same maximum amount of lot coverage, just shifting from 45% lot coverage to 50%. The floor area ratio, which relates to the scale of development, is almost identical, especially for multi-unit housing as well. One thing that is different is that the R2.5 zone typically limits developments such as townhouses to 4 units per lot, except there's an exception for cottage clusters. The RM1 zone provides more flexibility. A lot of our affordable housing development might have groupings of duplexes or groupings of townhouse clusters. You can't do that without a land division in the R2.5 zone. You can in the RM1 zone. Wanted to just show an aerial showing, again, in that outlined area, this proposed area that would be going from R2.5 to RM1. And the lot sizes vary considerably from about 5,000 square foot smaller lots to down along the southern edge. Some of the lots are ranging from 15,000 to 20,000 square feet. So those large lots, especially, which tend to work better in terms of providing flexibility for multi-units in the RM1 zone. Sure.
I appreciate the comparison of RM1 and R2.5, and I'll remind for a long time ago that I'd hoped that the city could just merge those zones together and make it all RM1. It wasn't something the city was ready to take on as part of the comp plan or the RIP process, but I think this illustrates that there's just a 10% building cover area difference. That's about it. But the way it's mapped in the city, there's lots of R2.5 close-in neighborhoods. And then when the city mapped on the multifamily zones, they did it more East Portland, like we're seeing right now. And they left all the close-in neighborhoods R2.5 like they are still today. So perhaps some other time. Thanks.
Yeah, and it is really about the flexibility. There is actually a recently approved project in the northeastern corner of this area, which is already RM1 for 16 townhouse units, and it would not have been possible without, again, a land division in the R2.5 zone. The cleared lot here is actually proposed for 6 small lot houses on about a 20,000 square foot lot. Because of the way land divisions work, a lot of the site area is gobbled up for a street. Just wanted to highlight too, but why this area? Why are we proposing multi-dwelling zoning for that particular location? And it really relates to its proximity to services. Here, the 72nd Favela is really intended to be the 100% corner in terms of commercial services. That's where the grocery store currently is. And this map is showing the distances in terms of walking distance. The darkest tone is a quarter-mile walking distance. The medium tone is a half-mile walking distance. And much of this area around Malden is within the quarter-mile to half-mile distance. And what would be unique about this center is many of our centers primarily are anchored by commercial services. This is an area that includes a school as an anchor as well as a park. So part of the idea is expanding options for more people to live close to those services and also support the economics for a business district in the area. More residents provides more of a customer base for an emerging business district in 72nd. That's what I had for the Malden Street area. I also wanted to talk a bit about what's intended for the 72nd and Favela area. This is an aerial showing the intersection of Favela and 72nd, and 2 places where their questions raised was the grocery store. What's the intention for that, especially given that usually our center policies call for allowing more intensity in those locations, and then what is the intention for the nearby manufactured dwelling park, which you can see pointed out there. And that particular manufactured dwelling park has 46 units. It's actually not very different in density from townhouses. If you could see just to the north of the manufactured dwelling park, you could see some townhouse type development. So I wanted to highlight that because in terms of housing opportunity and even numbers of people living close to things, manufactured dwelling parks are a resource in terms of multi-unit as well as affordability. In terms of the discussion we had as part of this project, there's a lot of community support for retaining the manufactured dwelling parks as an affordable housing resource in an area. I should also point out that we only recently in 2018 created a new zone, the RMP zone, intended to apply to manufactured dwelling parks and discourage their redevelopment into other uses. I wanted to say a little bit more about the vision for this area. The zoning that's proposed shows in the orange red tone where we're proposing the CM2 zone. And that's our 4-story zone, the standard zone we apply in most of our centers. It's a zoning you have on Southeast Woodstock, for example, in the commercial core area. And then further south, there's a bit of CM1 zoning. Right now, there's only about a equivalent of 2 blocks of commercial zoning here. The rezones would extend that Main Street to being about a 7-block distance. And the vision is this street is really seen by the community as the emerging neighborhood Main Street or business district for the area. And again, this is an area that lacks any sort of substantial neighborhood business district. You can see where the grocery store is with the zoning. We did not actually hold back on the zoning for the grocery store, so it could be redeveloped as a 4-story building in the future. The RMP, where the manufactured dwelling park is not proposed for a change. It is seen as part of that housing resource near services. One thing that is part of the vision for this area too is there are some upzones from lower density residential to multi-dwelling adjacent to that corridor. And one thing that has been part of a conversation with the community is just the fact that this kind of transformation will happen over time. It's not going to happen overnight. So the images on the right are ideas of how this could happen over time in terms of people adding commercial uses to a residential building, like you see in some areas like along Cully, and then over time seeing more new development. But yeah, so the vision is a neighborhood Main Street surrounded by residential. And this is highlighting the zone changes that are proposed. So you can see that we're going from the lower scale CM1 at the core commercial area to CM2. And actually I should, because there were very valid questions about why are we not changing the zoning or what is the future of that RMP zoning, I definitely wanted to open things up to questions. But the general thought was in the immediate future, it's an important resource that the community wanted to hang on to. Did want to say a little bit in relationship to the Bureau of Environmental Services request for additional properties going to open space. There are already about 6.5 acres of land that they had acquired that they're restoring for floodplain and riparian habitat restoration. They have requested that 2 additional properties they've acquired be added to what's already in the plan. And these projects or these properties are right adjacent to Johnson Creek. So they include part of the embankment of Johnson Creek over by 45th Place. And it's a total of about 15,000 square feet. Much of these properties is in the 100-year floodplain. They also are largely within the protection and conservation environmental overlay zones. So this zone change is something that BPS staff supports, and we'd encourage you to consider that. The topic is also brought up about the employment zones in the southern end of 82nd. And I've highlighted them in yellow here. There are about 50 acres of employment and industrial zoning in that area. This is an aerial showing that area. You can see that it's got a number of large site employment uses and warehouses and light industrial uses. And staff's response basically is this was really not seen as part of the scope of this project in terms of broad rezones away from employment zoning. The rezones we had related to employment are very targeted. Also, it is a city priority to preserve employment land. We really do not recommend that there be a substantial change to employment land unless there were maybe a broader look at the 82nd corridor. In terms of 82nd type lands with employment zoning, this area actually has an advantage of the larger sites, which are more viable for those employment uses. Did we want to have a conversation here about land use pieces, or should we move to the transportation topic?
Yeah, if there are any questions about the land use topics, we can certainly take a moment and address those questions. And then when we're ready, we'll move on to the transportation section. If there are no questions, that's fine too.
Commissioner Lang has a question, I think, or comment.
Is the grocery store that was identified there right at the intersection, is that the only grocery store in the whole area?
It is. There's a supermarket, more of an Asian-focused supermarket, The Edge, at 82nd and Foster, but it's really the only one in the core planning area.
So that could become more valuable as a redevelopment for housing right there, and that grocery store could go away?
The zoning would allow that to happen. I've spoken to the owner of the grocery outlet who has expressed his interest in being part of a business district, and it would be a very useful anchor. This particular person was mentioning that he had some interest in maybe adding a storefront component facing 72nd to maybe be part of that emerging business district. But so, yeah, zoning would allow a change away from that. But again, a property owner interest in staying in that area.
Okay. And then the slide that showed the Johnson Creek area, it looked like a private home on that. Is that a private residence that sits there?
Yeah, I believe so. Although when I've looked at it, there are multiple vehicles. I'm not sure if, because it's in this commercial employment zone directly on 45th Place, it may not be a purely residential type use. But the R5 zone property that's off of 45th is largely vacant. But both these properties, just to remind you, have been acquired by Bureau of Environmental Services.
Oh, they have. Okay.
And they see it as part of their efforts to address flooding in the area and riparian habitat restoration.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I see both of our vice chairs have their hand raised. Vice Chair Thompson, go ahead.
Thank you. Two of my comments were related to those that Commissioner Lang just voiced. I was curious how much redevelopment pressure there might actually be on that grocery outlet site, just going from CM1 to CM2. And I wanted to confirm that these properties that are identified for open space are already owned by the city, which it sounds like they are. And then the last thing was maybe if you could go back to an earlier slide and just touch a little bit more on some of the other areas where naturally occurring affordable housing is being preserved. I know that for me, the one that I was most interested in talking about was the manufactured home park that's there near 72nd and Flavel, but I am also curious to just get a higher level understanding of where else those occur in the plan area.
I have another slide that shows the locations of the manufactured dwelling parks and the naturally occurring apartment complexes, if it'd be useful for me to take you to that slide. Just a second. This slide is showing in those, I'm kind of colorblind, but the colored squares where the manufactured dwelling parks are. And you can see that there is one right near the core, center area. And the stars are showing where the naturally occurring apartments are. And many of those already are in multi-dwelling zoning, and we were not proposing to increase the development scale any further. But you can see that the blue areas and the red areas are avoiding those existing naturally occurring affordable apartments as well as the manufactured dwelling parks. You can see there are about half dozen manufactured dwelling parks around the proposed neighborhood center. And part of the equity piece of this in our community discussions was the idea that these people could really benefit from being close to more services, and the neighborhood center would be intended to serve that area of East Brentwood, Darlington, and Southern Lents. And the zoning is really intended to continue those manufactured dwelling parks so that people living there can continue to benefit from the improvements over time in the area.
Okay, thank you. So the east side of 72nd, that stretch between Duke and Flavel, that is not shown in blue, it is already zoned for that, correct?
Yes.
This is just identifying, okay.
Yeah, the zone changes actually, it's already RM1 where those apartment complexes are, and the zone changes are bringing additional properties into that low-rise multi-dwelling zoning.
Okay, so what I'm understanding is that this isn't really even so much of like a spot zoning approach where you're holding back properties that would otherwise be upzoned. This is pretty compatible with how density would occur anyway, right?
Correct.
Okay.
There's not spot zoning involved in terms of holding zoning back there. The approach is actually expanding zoning on the rest of the corridor where those apartments are.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Pouncil.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, I think it was in slide 12. The last time we spoke about this, we had public testimony, and there was a lot of I would say there was a fair amount of individuals who had come to kind of voice their concerns about displacement, and I had just noticed in that, and I believe it was slide 12, there was a likelihood of of people not being displaced. I was just wondering if you could just maybe elaborate on that a little bit more.
Sure. The majority of testimony received regarding concern about the changes to the zoning and what it might do for community stability is in that Malden Street area I'd gone over. And that's that area that's proposed to be rezoned from R2.5 townhouse zoning to the RM1 low-rise multi-dwelling zoning. And the economic analysis had really found that the increment of additional development allowed by that zone change has no real effect on the likelihood of displacement compared to the zoning that's already there. I mean, basically, the zoning, R2.5 zoning, already allows townhouses, which are an attractive development type. And even with the rezone to RM1, you may occasionally get small apartment developments, but townhouses are anticipated to continue to be the most common development type. So the basic answer is townhouses, either with existing zoning or the future zoning, is a likely development type, and so the change of the additional development allowances isn't anticipated to change the likelihood of displacement. One thing to highlight too is that in the zone changes areas, we did an analysis to look at home ownership versus rental, and it appears that about 71% of properties are home ownership properties. So people in this area have greater control over their properties as homeowners than is typical across the city. Only about, 47%, I believe, are actually 53% citywide are homeowners. This area has a higher rate of home ownership, including the Malden Street area.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefendorf for the record, just to maybe elaborate a little bit or make a finer point. This area has high home ownership already. The properties, so the people that we heard from are people who are who own their homes. And I think one of the things I recall about their testimony was them talking about the fact that they value the fact that they were able to purchase a home here, and they're just concerned about affordability going forward. But I think what our analysis, so two things that our analysis showed that I want to make sure to point out that Bill has already touched upon. But one is that the increment of change in that zoning doesn't materially push someone over to redevelop that site. It's a really small increment of change. Those folks who own their homes there, they would have to sell. They'd have to be willing sellers, and there would have to be somebody who would assemble probably several lots and to build a project. What this change does is simply allow, as Bill pointed out, that if that were to occur, that there would be more flexibility in the number of units that could be built in the zoning, and that's important to maintaining affordability as well, right? Because what another point that Bill made was that if the market is very constrained, then the housing stock that is available will be increasingly expensive because there's the limited supply. This very kind of modest ability to create additional capacity and to allow for some additional supply, coupled with the fact that the changes are pretty modest to begin with, should really kind of not result in displacement pressures. And that was really part of both the evaluation and the strategy for this plan. So really want to emphasize that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments on the land use portion? Go ahead, Commissioner Lang.
Thank you. Just one more question to that. If that was developed to a certain point with those additional units, parking wouldn't be required as part of that development. Is that correct?
Correct. We no longer require off-street parking.
Okay. So now we can talk about transportation and maybe some of those impacts. Thank you.
Thank you for that segue, Commissioner Lang. And just want to acknowledge all of the work, Bill, to follow up on our inquiries. Really appreciate that. And you did a terrific job on bringing that information back to us. Thank you.
Certainly. And turning it over to Shane.
Shane Valley, Senior Planner with the Bureau of Transportation, co-managing this project with Bill. Just a refresher on those areas of interest that I'm going to walk through. We're going to review the testimony that was raised and what we're doing to address it, and what we're doing in the now, the soon, and the long term in terms of addressing traffic safety issues. Second area, again, was what those local street improvements look like, how they relate to traffic calming, sidewalks, and safe routes to school. And the third area was how we're prioritizing the investments and what is the relationship of the core area to the surrounding areas. So this is a map of the written testimony that was mappable, that had some kind of geographic tag, and accompanying it are a couple of keywords that sort of describe in a few words what the gist of the concern was. And so we mapped this and we overlaid it with our recommended projects and some of our traffic calming measures. And just as a refresher, the orange lines on this map represent corridor improvement projects, which are projects that address safety conditions on the major streets in the district, like 52nd, 72nd, Woodstock. The green lines are neighborhood greenways that address conditions internal to those neighborhood cells, providing good local access to businesses and services on the busy streets. And then the hashed blue areas are our priority traffic calming areas. And so you can see just sort of by visual inspection of this map that pretty much every single piece of testimony that we could map does intersect with a recommended project or a traffic calming priority area. It's not enough just to say, okay, there's a line on a dot. We actually went through and checked to see do our recommendations reasonably address this testimony? And we found in pretty much every situation that our recommended projects either do, or some of the comments are extremely detailed and will be information that we can take as we start design on these projects. None of these projects we've designed yet. And so there's some specific comments about a particular corner and a particular curb ramp that we need to be attentive to. And so that's good information and that we can take into the next phase. As for what we're doing now about these issues and what's coming soon and what future opportunities are, I'm not going to go into detail about every single one of those, but coming soon, or things that we've recently finished. There's a tricky S-curve on 69th and Woodstock. People were leaving the roadway and crashing through people's yards and into their homes, and we found some money to quickly fix that. The 70s Neighborhood Greenway is under construction, and that will bring improved crossings of several busy streets, as well as improved north-south access for folks walking and biking. There's also the Arleta Triangle Square, which was a livability and gun violence reduction kind of pilot project. Things that are coming soon, the Brentwood Darlington Multimodal Project is a funded project that's going to bring sidewalks to Duke and Flavelle streets, as well as crossings there, and a new neighborhood greenway that spans east to west across the plan area. The 60s Neighborhood Greenway will begin construction. That should say 2024, but it'll begin construction in 2024, and that'll provide additional improved north-south access for folks walking and biking. We've got 2 new crossings coming on 82nd at Tolman and Lambert, and those are a part of our 82nd Avenue Critical Fixes project. And then we're also paying some special attention to Woodstock Boulevard, which is a little bit of a special case. On Woodstock Boulevard between 52nd and 72nd, there are no signals, there are no stop signs, and so that's a mile of street that has pretty much no traffic control. And so what a neighborhood serving street basically is used by some drivers to drive extremely fast. We've clocked folks doing 80, 90, 100 miles an hour on that stretch. So we're looking into that. As for future opportunities, just routine maintenance paving is happening on 52nd Avenue, and that's usually an opportunity for us to maybe kick in a few extra dollars if we can find something, and make some of the changes that are part of the recommended projects. There's a recommended corridor improvement on 52nd Avenue, and so paving will be an opportunity to implement some of that. And then there are also grant opportunities, whether we're talking about Metro grant opportunities, federal grant opportunities, that a lot of these projects will be competitive for. That second area of interest was about the local street improvements. What do those look like? What does traffic calming look like? How does it relate to safe routes to school? And I wanted to bring back this graphic from last time I was here in October, just to explain that there are kind of 2 things shown on this map that at first blush don't maybe seem related. And those are, the brown lines are showing local street pavement priorities, where we thought it was most important to improve the condition of pavement. And then the blue hashed out area are the traffic calming areas. And yeah, I think at just walking through that now, like, it kind of, what do those 2 things have to do with each other? And they're both trying to address comfort for people walking, biking, and rolling. And when we hear folks ask for sidewalks, in addition to just hearing that folks want to see the city paying attention and want to see the city, this part of the town, have a similar level of infrastructure as other parts of Portland, they're also asking for a comfortable and safe place for people to walk, to bike, and to roll. And so these 2 things are on the same map because infrastructure around the plan area sort of varies. And so, for example, in that central Brentwood-Darlington area that's hashed out, most of those streets are paved. Actually, none of the streets have sidewalks, though. And so the approach that we're taking there, the elephant in the room being that building out a full street and building out sidewalks is extremely expensive. What we're trying to do in some nearer term is to address that need for comfort and safety through traffic calming, through saying, how can we make the infrastructure that we have there now work better, while there are some longer term discussions about how do we get this part of town to parity in terms of quality of infrastructure. And then for the unpaved streets and the areas with unpaved streets, what's needed to create conditions for people to feel comfortable walking, biking, and rolling is often paved streets. So those are why these 2 things are shown on the same map and what they're trying to do. In terms of what those street improvements could look like, again, those full street construction, which is a 24 feet of paving in the middle, curbs, furnishing zones, sidewalks on both sides of the streets, that's very expensive to do. There's no dedicated funding to do these traffic calming and paving measures, let alone the full street construction. And so we're trying to be realistic about when we get money, we want to stretch that dollar as far as possible. The Arrowhead Heights Street Improvement Project is really instructive. It's a project that's going on in the plan area. It's instructive in how it, both what the treatments could look like and how funding could actually happen. And so this is a graphic from that effort that shows early on in the effort, the city went to neighbors and said, hey, what kinds of street options are you interested in pursuing? And there were sort of the full suite of options, from the full street to this to some other options. And this was this is a shared residential street that has traffic calming. And this was kind of one of the main choices that residents and community members in the area selected. And this is similar to what we could see in the Brentwood-Darlington core area in those streets that are south of Woodstock Boulevard. So narrow streets that meet our 15 mile an hour street standard that allow us to do more aggressive traffic calming like speed humps and chicanes, which are where the roadway kind of weaves a little bit. So it basically makes it impossible for a driver to drive straight and fast. And that really helps create those conditions for drivers that are operating their vehicles at speeds more similar to folks walking, biking, and rolling. So that's one example of what this could look like. And then the instructive bit about how this actually can come to pass. The only way we were able to do this was working in partnership with BES, who had a stormwater issue that they needed to address in this area. And so they brought sort of the lion's share of the resources there. Street reconstruction was something that they needed to do. And they brought us in to sort of help understand what those options could be. We worked with residents to stand up a local improvement district, which is where residents kick in a little bit of money. But the lion's share of the resources was brought by another of our partner infrastructure bureaus. And that's likely the only way we would be able to do a lot of these other improvements just because of the size of the ask. Traffic calming, just briefly again. So just what the plan is and what it does and what it doesn't do. This identifies areas that we need to continue to study. The plan lacked resources to develop traffic calming strategies for the specific areas. Ideally, we would have a category of project that complements the other recommended projects, the corridor improvements and the neighborhood greenways, where we actually identified we're putting speed bumps on this street, we're putting diverters on this street, we're going to monitor this street. We just didn't have the time and the resources to do that. And so this identifies sort of the next step. And that core Brentwood-Darlington area is kind of priority number one for when we have resources to do that. And then as for alignment with Safe Routes to School, this is a map that shows the Safe Routes to School primary investment routes. Those orange lines leading to the orange squares and rectangles, which represent schools. And this was an input to our recommended projects. And so this slide shows in blue, so in orange are the primary investment routes, and in blue are the recommended projects. And you can see the multiple places where they really closely overlap, and that was intentional. That's how we developed some of our recommended projects. And there's actually a nice little dance that we can do between Lower Southeast and Safe Routes to School. So that was an input, and so we took it where it made sense for the transportation system. And next year, the Safe Routes to School program is going to do an update to this plan, and so that will be an opportunity to say, hey, we were able to align here. Here, it didn't really make sense from a transportation point of view to align. Is there any way we could realign the primary investment routes to take advantage of the investments that we're going to make in a neighborhood greenway or on a busy street or on a busy street crossing? And then that third area of interest was about how did we prioritize, what does prioritization mean, and how do these projects relate to the surrounding transportation network. So this, again, is a map of our recommended projects, the corridor improvements in orange, the neighborhood greenways in green, and then they are here, there's another division between Tier 1 and Tier 2. The Tier 1 projects are those solid lines. The Tier 2 projects are the dashed lines. And so what does Tier 1 and Tier 2 mean? Tier 1 means these are the projects that we're going to take what limited sort of staff resources we have to chase down additional design details, to respond to that detailed testimony, to work to find funding, to develop grant asks. Those are the places that we're going to focus on in the next 5 years. The Tier 2 projects are the ones that we're not going to focus as much in the next 5 years, which isn't to say if there weren't some unique option or opportunity to get a Tier 2 project funded, we would say, no, that's a Tier 2 project. No, we would definitely take the opportunity to do that. In terms of why or how we prioritize, there were three major factors that helped us prioritize. The first was, is this project in the plan, the core area of the plan, the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood? The second factor was, is this co-located with a center or a corridor designation, whether that's existing or coming or recommended or proposed, rather. We want to support that vision with the transportation. This is really where the transportation land use combo is paying off. And then the third element was, is this on a street or does it lead to a street with frequent transit? And then just getting to what is the relationship of this area and these recommended projects to the surrounding transportation network. Noting that the core project area, that was the original project area. And as we started doing more investigation of what are the needs, it became clear that a lot of folks need to get from this core area to the existing destinations on the fringes, on Foster, Lentz, the Woodstock Main Street, and the other nodes of businesses and services that kind of are on the fringes of this. And so we expanded the project area to reflect that. And you can see how most of the recommended projects, especially the Tier 1 projects, originate in the Brentwood-Darlington core area and then sort of radiate outwards from there. And then kind of late in the game, we realized we needed to do sort of even more. On the very edges of the map, there's a project on Holgate and a project on 92nd Avenue. And those are the very edges, just in recognition further that we need to make sure we're doing a really good job of connecting this area beyond. And those Holgate and 92nd Avenue projects really focus on improving the quality and condition of crossings. And that's all for me.
I guess before we open it up to questions, and because we're on the slide anyway, just to remind you, after today's work session, at least we're scheduled to have another work session and the recommendation for November 28th. That's for what's upcoming, but definitely happy to entertain your questions for transportation or land use.
Go ahead, Commissioner Patel.
Commissioner Patel, for the record, always forget that. But so I had a comment and a question. One of the aspects that I really like about this plan is that it not only addresses housing, but also necessary and related infrastructure, transportation investments for an area that's been underserved historically for a long time. You mentioned Metro and state grant opportunities for the transportation investments, and a few of the slides said that there's no dedicated funding yet. Has the city been actively looking for funds? Because I know the 82nd plan received federal, state, and metro funds, but for this area, is that in process as well?
Yeah, so there are a couple of projects that we've already sort of are top of mind in the PBOT planning division as things that we're going to apply for money for, but we're also looking to the renewal of our Fixing Our Streets bond measure gas tax, and not picking out specific projects, but saying, hey, here's a bucket of money that we'd like to be able to pull from to fund projects like this, projects that are going on in a similar effort in North Portland. North Portland in Motion is kind of in a very similar place as this plan. So yeah, we have our eye out. We're pretty good at identifying grant opportunities just because there's so little fungible discretionary money that we have. We need to, we often have to find money elsewhere. And so, yeah, those are two of the ways that we're looking for.
Thank you.
Commissioner Alexander?
Yes, thank you very much. In some ways, this is a sort of a piggyback on Commissioner Patel's question. As we look at this particular project and the sort of companion focus around transportation and traffic control, have we also sort of began to look at areas of industrial development so that, for me, when I think about housing, the cream of the crop is workforce housing, people who are able to live and work in same neighborhoods. And so as we're looking at these long-term planning and the potential intersections, it would be helpful to just know, I understand the focus of this initiative, but at some point there are downstream impacts that hopefully other fellow travelers around this planning effort for the city are thinking about. Transporting people from point A to point B, if there's a significant distance, is great. However, the ability to walk to work is even better. So I'm hoping that at some point, you know, our wish list, I understand there's no funding and time is of the essence, but at some point, a closed mouth doesn't get fed. So just offer as a thought as we continue to sort of look at long-term visioning.
Thank you for that, yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Lang, go ahead.
I know a lot of the testimony was around traffic safety and just transportation in general and how to get around the neighborhood. nothing was said about street lighting. Is there enough street lighting there now? Is that a component of safety in there, and has that been discussed at all as part of this?
Good question. It's actually not something we heard a ton about. Um, this part of town, the busy streets are narrow enough that they at least meet city standard for. I mean, lighting around Portland in general is pretty is pretty poor. I mean, there are reasons for that, and it's a really complicated issue that has to do with light pollution and whatnot. But it wasn't something that we heard a lot about. And the busy streets in the neighborhood are narrow enough that the lighting on one side of the street, at least by sort of base city standards, is able to illuminate both sides of the street if there's just one luminaire on one side of the street, which is the case in most of the district. But we didn't hear much about the lighting.
Thank you so much, Shane. I don't know if you could tell from my expression, but I continue to be super concerned and shocked, but also not super surprised hearing cars late at night blasting through the neighborhood. So just really appreciate you bringing back all this great information. I had a couple of follow-up questions that weren't addressed in your information, so hopefully don't throw you off base here, but just in the vein of other things you might have heard in your community engagement. One of the things I've noticed on 62nd, right in front of Brentwood Park, is folks are in wheelchairs in the street, and there are no curb ramps. Has that been raised, and is that something that is going to potentially be addressed?
Yes, that's been raised. More, yeah, like I think the ADA issues on Brentwood Darlington, or the Brentwood City Park, were one of the first things we heard about. Right now, I think that lives in the 60th, the traffic calming area that you see. That's kind of a footnote there in that central Brentwood Darlington area, and then along the 60th Avenue neighborhood greenway, and as prioritizing improved curb ramp access to and from Brentwood City Park.
That's great. I'm so glad to hear that. And then secondly, we've got a lot of alleys in the neighborhood. And from what I can tell, it doesn't look like any prioritized improvements are paving over those alleys. But I was just curious because I know there are some folks that actually see alleys as traffic calming, as opportunities for sort of extensions of gardens, et cetera. And it can be kind of a controversial topic. Did that come up in the context of what you heard from community members, specifically on those streets that have unpaved or unimproved?
Oh yeah, I mean, people love it. It is very controversial, and actually, I can't say that we actually heard a ton of people saying, "Please pave my street," just because I think it used to be. I think the city has sort of not been attendant to this for so long that people have kind of made the street their own. I mean, we saw like BMX pump tracks out there. We saw gardens that sort of spilled out into the street. And I mean, I think there's something in written testimony that says, hey, this is marked as a paving priority. Please don't pave the street. Like right now, it's only like a footpath, and we really value for that connectivity, and we don't want sort of cars rushing through there. So part of what we did with identifying them as priorities was setting it up for further conversation, because I think whether people want or don't, how they want their streets to function maybe paving is not the answer. And it's at the city, we like to hear that because it's expensive, and we want to do things for people, but we want to be able to spread the peanut butter so we can help as many people as possible. So yeah, it's definitely controversial. It's definitely not going to be a one size fits all, like, yep, we're going to pave your street kind of thing.
Thank you. And my son uses that pump track. So I know if he was here, he would say, do not pave it. Thank you so much. Any additional questions or comments from commissioners on the transportation items? Okay. This item will continue to the November 28th. Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Spivak.
Thank you. I wonder whether we, I like what's been presented to us. We had a lot of public comment. On the land use side, I feel like staff's response to it. I'm wondering whether we amend this to add in those two lots, the open space zoning, and vote it through now. Would that work? Like, why wait? Exactly. Like, if I'm not sure why this needs to be on the agenda again if we're not workshopping ideas for amendments.
Okay.
If Patricia Diefendorfer for the record, I think that there's no problem. Just trying to think if there would be any noticing issue, but given that the public record is closed, I don't think there would be any problem with you taking the vote now if you were so inclined. I think we would encourage you to vote on the amendments and then vote on the whole package. But yeah, absolutely. If you're so inclined, that would be great.
Well, I'd make a motion that the lots owned by BES proposed by staff to be changed to open space zoning be changed as part of this project. Is that a good enough description, staff, of that amendment? Okay, that's a better reference. Yes, thank you. You're testing my memory there. So I recommend, as a proposed amendment, what's on the slide right now, 2 properties adjacent to Johnson Creek be changed to open space zoning.
I second that amendment. Commissioner Routh for the record.
Okay, any discussion on the amendment? All right, I think we can proceed to roll call.
Alexander. Lang.
Aye.
Patel.
Aye.
Pouncil.
Aye.
Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
O'Mara.
Aye. Okay, and it sounds like we would like to proceed with a recommendation to approve the Lower Southeast Rising Plan.
Unless someone else wants to, I would be happy to make that motion to approve
As
the plan.
amended, could I just interject
As
that?
amended.
As amended, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Bill Scudder.
I do have a question. Staff have noticed a few corrections that need to be made to the plan, not substantive. Is it possible for any motion to support recommendation of the plan to provide staff leeway to make some Scribner's corrections? Or whatever the legal term is.
Sure. Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. Bill, do you mind just describing, are they literally edits, like typographical kinds of edits? And what, maybe if you could just describe a little bit what level of change? Clearly
There's
not
small things like
substantive,
one map that shows the zone changes, shows CM1, and it mislabeled one part of it as part of it's already CM1, and the mapping was not clear about that. It's just little mapping corrections. They're not changing what the outcome is, but where there are small errors, being able to make corrections. And Shane, were there any transportation related?
Yeah, there's one mapping error, is just a discrepancy between a classification change and a recommended project. They were supposed to be aligned on the same street, and I think I missed the boat on making sure that it was aligned. So
I'm okay with those. I mean, I would say a motion for to adopt this project as amended just now, and with clerical changes for the recommended draft. That'd be my motion, I guess.
I second. Is there any discussion, the recommendation?
Do we want to limit those changes then just to the mapping changes that they discussed? Or do you need a broader?
Can we, Mike Alexander for the record, can we simply say approval subject to identified mapping errors? I mean, that we have spoken to. So anything that we have not raised is not subject to change, but anything that we have raised is.
Sure.
That sounds great.
Okay. So I think we are ready to take roll.
Great. Alexander.
Aye.
Lang.
Aye.
Patel.
Aye.
Pouncil.
Aye.
Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
O'Mara.
Aye. The plan is approved. Congratulations.
Thank you
to
commissioners.
staff and-
Congratulations to you
Yes,
too. Yeah.
thank you to everyone who was engaged in this multi-year process, and to staff for your presentation and all of your hard work. So this item will not continue
Okay.
on to the November 28th agenda. Thank you so much. Okay, and we will go ahead and move forward to our next item on the agenda, which is the Housing Regulatory Relief Project.
Commissioners, do you mind if we take a few minutes break?
Sure, we'll go ahead and
Thank
take a few minutes for a break and reconvene. Let's call it 1:45, potentially? Okay. the November 14th, 2023 City of Portland Planning Commission meeting. I am the chair, Mary Rain O'Mara, and we are progressing now to our housing regulatory relief project. This is a work session, and hopefully we're getting to a recommendation today. So before I hand it over to staff present to walk us through the proposed amendments, are there any items of disclosures from commissioners on this agenda item? Welcome, Sandra Wood and Phil Namany.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for having us again today. My name is Sandra Wood. I'm the Co-Development Manager at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And Phil Namany is here with me. He is the Project Manager for the Housing Regulatory Relief Project. Thank you for the work session you held last week. It was very helpful to us, and I'm sure to the Commission, to have some time to discuss what potential amendments or ideas you had to improve this project. And we heard back from all the commissioners. Well, we heard back at that session from the commissioners, and we issued a memo that's dated November 9th, 2023. And I wanted to ensure that all the commissioners had that in front of them, because we'll be using that as our basis for discussion today. We have hard copies if any of you need that. Looks like, great, thank you. It looks like everybody has that. On the memo, is a list of potential amendments. There are 4 of them. The first one includes a technical bundle, and then the next ones are singular items. And the way we thought we'd proceed today is that Phil will give you just an overview of what the amendment is. The exercise here is that we've published a proposed draft, and the amendment will be amending the proposed draft. And then we would publish a proposed draft as amended, which we call a recommended draft later. So we were thinking that Phil would just give an overview of that, and then the commissioner who is sponsoring or suggested the amendment would have an opportunity to describe why they think this is a good amendment. I think you all probably covered most of your bases last week talking about this. And then we would take a vote on each one of them. So let's start with the technical amendments. This is actually one where we do the grouping. These are just technical amendments and make no substantive changes. And Commissioner Spivak was the requester, because Commissioner Spivak read the code in detail, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you. And I believe that most of these items were trying to implement the intent rather than, I don't think most of these change the intent of the code. So the first one, was just missing a word, with, sites with residential uses. The second one on bike parking relates to, I heard that at least one reviewer was perhaps saying that the 5-foot distance that you have to access your bike rack was width and length, so therefore a 5-foot square box. Having been involved in this project, I believe the intention was to say that you have to have a 5-foot backup distance, but the width was the width of the bike storage area. So this was a clarification. I think that was my understanding of staff, that was the intent for BPS. So this just changes the table labeling to clarify that it's maneuvering depth, not maneuvering area for bikes. We did say some testimony presuming that it was a 5-foot by 5-foot square, which triggered me to think about this is an interpretation issue. On ground floor windows, in a couple places, the code said that during this 5-year time period, you get to go down to I can't remember exactly what the code was, but it basically implied that you could potentially get out of the glazing requirement entirely, when the intention was clearly, instead of 60% glazing, you go down to 40% glazing. So the idea is not that if you have housing, you can have no glazing at all in your facade. This was to correct that. So, and the last one, staff suggested I propose, which I'm fine with, which is to, you want to describe this, Phil or Sandra?
Yeah, the one with the design review exemption was just to clarify, we were listing 3 things that were exempt: lighting, gates, and cameras. And somebody was asking, well, what are the requirements for the camera? And essentially, we just wanted to exempt them. So this just clarifies that it's only the security gates and lighting that have these additional standards about pointing downward or the visibility aspect. So it's just to kind of separate out the
the security cameras from any kind of standard.
And the last item is just the city is, through this project, removing on-street parking impacts as a criteria for evaluating transportation system impacts. And they did it in every code section, many pages, except for some reason, mining and waste related. I did not look for that, but I did a search and it came up there. So that one, I'm sure that was the intention as well. So that's the first batch.
Do you want to move that first
Oh,
batch?
I would move the passage of amendments, the technical amendments, number 1.
I second.
Okay, any discussion on the proposed amendment to technical items? Okay, Julie, please call roll.
Alexander. Aye. Lang.
Aye.
Patel.
Aye.
Council.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I need a little bit more clear. The technical, meaning just the technical on those two things that Commissioner Spivak had spoke about.
Just the technical amendments, which were that first grouping of 5 technical amendments.
On the biking, on the bike parking, and was it on glazing as well, or just the bike parking? I'm so sorry.
On all 5 things that Commissioner Spivak just spoke about and ran through for us. A missing word, the bike parking maneuvering area, ground floor window, that 40% still applies, and an approval criteria for mining and waste related.
Okay. All right. So it's just clarification on the language.
Exactly.
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Council. Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
O'Meara.
Aye. The amendment is approved.
Great, thank you. So moving on to amendment number 2, which is about bird safe glazing requirements. Phil, can you walk us through that, please?
So this came out of the discussions from last week. Our initial proposal was, just to suspend them for 5 years. What the request that came in was to acknowledge that ground floors often have a higher percentage of windows, and to come up with an option that would still allow the upper floors to maintain 30% glazing while allowing the ground floor to have a higher percentage. We went through and did a few scenarios, kind of looking at if ground floor had about 60%, which of course up until this passage would be the minimum on a lot of these streets, while maintaining 30% on the upper floors. It can be difficult to kind of calculate because of course floor heights can vary. So we did a few options, if we had a 12-foot, if all the floors were at 12 feet, or if the ground floor was at 15 and the upper floors were maybe at 11, something that kind of got 4 or 5 floors within that 60 feet of facade that would be subject to the bird safe glazing. So we came out with different percentages that kind of went above the 30%, ranging between 35 and 37%. So we went with the 37% as sort of the most liberal of those options. So essentially the idea would be, it could still maintain 30% on the upper floors, while having more on the ground floor. Obviously, if somebody wants to put 100% on the ground floor, they would have to have less on the upper floors. But the measurement that is done is on the exterior elevation. So it's essentially between 0 and 60 feet above the grade. So, that could potentially be 3 floors if you're doing something with tall ceilings or a more spacious type thing. But that we wanted to keep the 60-foot kind of measurement intact. So the amendment is just going from 30 to 37% for 5 years.
For the trigger. Commissioner Thompson, you were one of the proponents of this amendment. Did you have anything to add?
Sure. I guess I'm supportive of the overall intent of the amendment as you described, but it's not exactly what I had in mind last week. And so I just kind of want to talk through that a little bit for commissioners and also understand in a little bit better detail what some of the implementation challenges might be with my approach.
So just to back up, the reason that I was proposing this is because I'm interested in finding a way for bird safe glazing to not be a barrier to housing development, and also to not increase bird strike incidents on buildings. If we operate from the assumption that a 30% glazing ratio is kind of a reasonable lower limit for housing, the original bird safe glazing code was written to address that. So if you're below 30%, you don't have to do it. I think this is fine, except for the fact that it doesn't make an accommodation for a glacier ground floor, which may be a requirement of the building. So I was interested in trying to establish a pathway to provide a glacier ground floor, allowing developments to still remain below the 30% on floors up above and not have to do bird safe glazing there. When I was talking through this at our last meeting, what I imagined the approach might be is to say, if you have glass in excess of 30% window to wall ratio just at the ground floor, you only would have to do bird safe glazing there. We're not going to make you apply it to the entire facade where you just have housing on floors up above, as long as you're still below the 30%. It sounds like there are some complexities with trying to define the ground floor. Eli raised the idea of just saying any residential floor that has glazing that's below 30% should not have to do bird safe glazing. That seems like another way to skin it. So I'm interested to get staff's comments on that. But yeah, it just seems like if we can define the ground floor from a glazing percentage standpoint to say it has to be 40 or 60, you know, depending on the number that we're talking about here, why can't we take that same approach in terms of creating some definition for the bird safe glass requirement?
Do you want to start? Well, I was just, I think the approach that we came up with is simpler, right? It's just the trigger is increased, period. And the measurement right now is the facade from 0 to 60 feet, measuring that full facade. So this doesn't change how the measurement is occurring. It just changes at 37%. That's when the bird safe glazing would be triggered. There's a couple of things that I think make the two approaches that we've heard a little difficult. Is that we don't want to be looking at the floor plans of each floor to determine what the use is for each of the floors to determine whether the bird safe glazing applies or not. So maybe all of the residential uses are way up high and 0 to 60 feet is office uses or something. The point is that the birds aren't going to know the difference, right? If they're if those windows have residential or office behind it. So I think that's one of the reasons we went with this approach. The other thought I had when you were describing it, I think what you're describing is if the ground floor is in excess of 30%, then the ground floor doesn't trigger the bird safe glazing. But what if the upper floors have more than 30%? They would trigger it. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that you would, if anywhere on the ground floor exceeds 30%, you would need to do bird safe glazing on that ground floor, not on the whole facade. Because right now, if you have a glacier ground floor, then it requires you to do bird safe on the whole facade because it tips you over that entire ratio. So that's where I think the issue is. If you did look at 30% as a functional minimum for the upper floors for a glazing ratio for housing units, and you want a glacier ground floor, well, why can't you just put bird safe glass on the ground floor?
Vice Chair Thompson, Patricia Diefender for the record. I just wanted to offer something. I'm not sure if it helps completely, but I think raising that. So I think when BDS is reviewing plans for, compliance with this and whether it's triggered or not, I think we're trying to keep that review similar and not just, as Sandra said, distinguish between use or ground floor or upper floor, but rather raising that number simply kind of averages out, recognizing that you typically, even with these changes, have a more transparency on the ground floor, and assuming that you're going to hold on the 30% on the upper floors. That number that staff came up with is sort of what the number would be if you average it out and assume that the ground floor has a certain level of transparency and the upper floors have the 30% and do not exceed that. So it's just I think from an implementation standpoint, it's more consistent with the way that staff currently reviews plans for compliance with this or for figuring out whether it's triggered or not, and then for compliance. And so it just maintains that same kind of method of evaluating that criteria with materially, no change. So that's kind of, I think, why staff is proposing the amendment as they have, if that's helpful.
Eli Spivak, for the record, I was agreeing with you for everything except for that last bit, because I think materially it does change what gets built. I think that as I heard the amendment from Commissioner Thompson, it would have held harmless the residential floors of the building, but there still could be bird-safe glazing requirements for the first 15 feet for the first floor, which is where most birds are. That's where they get reflection of landscaping. As staff proposed it, 37% would remove bird-safe glazing requirements, not just for the residential, but also the ground floor commercial. So I think that what's at play here between two different ways to implement, I agree that it is easier to say 37% or whatever across the whole building. That is the easier way to write the regulation. But as written that way, I think buildings would not have ground floor bird glazing, who otherwise would be required under current code. So I think that there is a way of writing it. I'm not saying it's the easiest, where we just exempt residential floors from bird-safe glazing if they're under 30%, which is what the code says today. And in that case, the ground floor may or may not be bird-safe, depends on what the percentage is for the whole 60 feet.
I guess one thing I'm a little bit confused on is, the current provision is that it gets triggered at 30%, whether it's residential or not.
Right.
And we're saying, is the idea that we don't require the bird-safe glazing on the upper floors because the overall 0 to 60 foot height went over 30%, and we only require it on the ground floor? Because I think that's what I'm hearing, but I don't see where this amendment does much beyond what we already have, which is a 30% threshold that's measured in that whole area from 0 to 60 and however wide the building is. And then if that goes over 30%, then it's triggered and you have to meet the bird-safe glazing requirements. If it's not, then you don't. So we're instead the other thing that I'm not sure about is, we're currently in a lot of communication with BDS and internally about what is the ground floor. And so I'm not sure, if we start distinguishing again, another standard that distinguishes between ground floor and above the ground floor, that adds more potential for interpretation. What is a mezzanine? What is a tall lobby? Things like that. And so I don't know that we want to start distinguishing that. And I don't know what benefit we're getting if we're saying the ground floor can go above 30%, but the ground floor then has bird-safe glazing, but the upper floors don't if they maintain the 30%, because that's currently what the standard has. So it seems like we're carving out this strange little ground floor piece.
The one last piece where you say what the current standard is. The current standard is 0 to 60 feet, right? And the point that Commissioner Thompson brought up is that if residential, practically speaking, is going to be about 30%, and code requires the ground floor to be 40 to 60%, depending on where we land on that, then that means by requirement, the whole building is going to trigger bird-safe glazing, including the residential floors.
And that's
Correct?
what the 37% trigger solves for.
But
Because if you had,
the question is, does it oversolve for it? That's my point, because it does
that
solve
the
for that issue. You're
concern?
right. The concern I have is that by applying the 37%, we've ensured that all the ground floors, big glazing areas, don't get any bird-safe protection. That's the question.
Patricia Diefenhofer for the record. So just maybe a couple of thoughts to help facilitate the discussion. One is we're we're looking for overall flexibility as well. So I think again, and to not get into the issues of defining a ground floor and whatever interpretation issues there may be. The purpose of this package of regulations is to create flexibility and to allow facilitate housing production. The ground floors could be housing, they could be not at this point, right? With the changes that are proposed. So this standard as written just generally creates more flexibility. I guess one question would be, Commissioner Spivak, you just said that the ground floors are potentially the area that's most important in terms of the glazing for birds. I don't actually know that to be a fact. So I think if anyone has information about that specifically, but I'm not sure how how I think just changing the percentage is probably from an implementation standpoint and from the standpoint of trying to create flexibility, the easiest way to accomplish what I think we're trying to accomplish, which is recognizing that the upper stories, if this is about a trigger, this whole standard is about when bird glazing gets triggered and not necessarily where it gets triggered. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I just wanted to. I don't know if anyone has anything more to add specifically about the safety of birds on that sort of 0 to 15 feet from the ground level, because I don't particularly have information on that.
I mean, this might be something that, once again, this is a 5-year temporary piece. I think this is a provision that applies only if the building has residential uses in it. So a complete office commercial building would still have to do the 30% trigger or do bird safe glazing. So it's just not distinguishing necessarily where those residential uses are placed. There can also be an issue. I mean, floors do not always have just one use. A floor might partially be a parking garage with some residential. A floor might be a combination of office and residential. So we don't necessarily want to distinguish about a floor in residential use because that's very hard to track. I think.
Oh, this is Commissioner Pouncil. I'm sorry. I just had a quick question here. The higher threshold means more building with glass that doesn't have glazing. Am I correct on that?
That doesn't have bird safe glazing, correct. So with the higher threshold, that would mean fewer projects would trigger the need to install bird safe glazing.
Okay, and that would mean more birds. We would have more bird strikes.
Yes.
There is the potential for that. I mean, once again, I think the proposal, I mean, I don't like using the term hatchets, but the request on this was based upon a survey. The survey was very general. Bird safe glazing was supposedly an issue. The proposal was essentially cutting it off at the legs. I think if we were going to try to create something very nuanced, it needs the studies. I mean, I've heard also that birds often, the bird strikes often happen at the tree level. And so that's not necessarily at the ground floor. It can be at those upper floors. And so I don't, when we start having these discussions about put bird safe glazing on the ground floor, but not on the upper floor, I mean, we're starting to make decisions without the science. And so the percentage was sort of the simplest kind of way to allow additional flexibility. If the Planning Commission is not comfortable with that, then there may be another decision on that.
Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. Commissioner, Vice Chair Pouncil, just wanted to make sure that you were, the standard to trigger the requirement would go from 30% to 37%. So it's a fairly modest increase in that percentage for purposes of trigger, and it's really meant to kind of average out the greater transparency on the ground floor, anticipating that the upper floors would remain at that kind of lower transparency. If any project deviates from that, they would then trigger the requirement. So just want to make sure that that it's a
I do
that's a
under-
modest
I-
change. Yeah.
I do understand
Okay.
that. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I guess my problem with this is that this kind of it does kind of ignore the science, and there's been a lot of work that has been a lot of rigorous science that has been put into implementing these codes originally. And I mean, this is just my comment, on this, but I think we should just be thinking very carefully about this, because I don't want to be responsible for changing this amendment, and then we end up having more death because of the decisions that we've made, without having some science behind us legitimizing this change.
Commissioner Routh, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Pouncil, and thank you. Also, I know that these are really quick turnarounds, so for I'm in. I am lost related to this and the next one in terms of what are the potential consequences and the difference. I know that there was a lot of conversation that went into bird glazing over the course of, I don't know if months or years, where they did go to 30% as opposed to 37. And I don't know what the calculus was there. And I'm afraid I will just say that my ignorance of that, I'm not likely to get less ignorant in the next 20 minutes. With apologies, and I am concerned about agreeing to something in this that has the consequences, the type of consequences that Commissioner Pouncil just identified. So that's where I'm thinking.
So maybe I can take a step back and remind us all of where we are. There was a project that happened with a lot of looking at the science and figuring out what the requirement should be. And that project resulted in a trigger at 30%. So between 0 and 60 feet, measuring the facade, if there's more than 30% windows, that triggers the need for bird safe glazing on the building, and it gets implemented. Our proposed draft was to do a simple, for 5 years, we're not applying this. And that's, as you know, our whole proposal, and that was our kind of approach to this whole project. I think the discussion that you all had last week was not feeling comfortable with that, hearing a lot of testimony saying there's good reasons, sound policy, why we have bird safe glazing requirements. And like Commissioner Routh, I don't know why the 30% exactly was picked. My understanding that 20% was the ideal for saving birds' lives, but 30% was picked because of affordable.
Some energy code thresholds that get triggered.
Right, energy codes, thresholds, requirements that could trigger. I'm not going to purport to be an expert on that. So there is a reason for the 30%. And I think this commission did not feel comfortable with waiving that requirement for 5 years. So I suppose that could still be an option, is just to take the whole amendment off the table so to propose an amendment, and we could probably do that here maybe after a 5-minute recess, on not, so pulling this amendment from staff's proposed draft, and which would retain the 30% or the bird safe glazing requirement. This was a compromise to get more buildings out of having to provide bird safe glazing, but I think maybe I don't know if we misunderstood. Our approach was to keep the same regulatory structure, change the trigger from 30 to 37%. Based on several calculations of buildings and allowing for that ground floor to have more glazing up to 60% and upper floors to be at 30%. And we arrived at a range of 35 to 37%, which I think does the trick. Except what I'm hearing from at least Commissioner Spivak, I'm not sure, Commissioner Thompson, where you're landing on this, is that you wanted to guarantee that the ground floor could have, that there's not an interplay between the ground floor and the upper floors, that they're calculated separately, which is not an amendment we have written up right now.
Can I also, Patricia Diefender, for the record, one of the things that I heard from our conversation last week at our special meeting was the desire, and I think Vice Chair Thompson, you were expressing this, if I understood correctly, the desire to not kind of, penalize the more transparent ground floor, right? So that's where I think that led us down the path of thinking about not necessarily distinguishing ground floor from upper floors or the uses, but rather knowing that another one of our topics is about ground floor transparency and just trying to maintain visibility on the ground floor to whatever degree as possible, activation on the ground floor, and all good planning principles, around that to not penalize the ground floor for having more transparency. So that led us down the path of just raising the percentage to account for that, because that's how it's I mean, I think to Sandra's point, earlier point, that is how it's evaluated now, right? It's not based on use; it's just based on overall percentage of transparency, and so this just applies the same thinking, but accounts for a more transparent ground floor. If we have a different objective, then I think that's something that we need to talk about further. So I'm hoping, Vice Chair Thompson, since you had the idea to begin with, maybe you could help us through thinking it something more along the lines that you are thinking of.
I mean, I think that we're mostly on the same page. It's just that the implementation is looking a little bit different. And I do think that the outcome will be different as a result, because with what I was proposing, it wouldn't increase the unprotected glazing on a facade over the current rules, which are that once you get to 30%, you have to do bird safe. You could not have more glass than that was unprotected with what I was proposing. It would just say that if you want to have a glassier ground floor, you would only have to do bird safe glazing at that glassier ground floor, not up to 60 feet where you only have 30%. To me, that doesn't seem materially different, because if you have a 30% window to wall ratio at floors like 3 through 6, it doesn't really matter what's happening on the ground floor. So it sounds like there are some challenges with ground floor definition, which I still don't totally understand, because we have to define the ground floor to be able to do the ground floor glazing requirements anyways. So it seems like we have to be able to define ground floor to enact that requirement. So I'm not sure why we couldn't do something similar for this. I don't dispute that the overall percentage is easier. I do think that there could be more bird strikes as a result. I don't have any of the science on the where or the how, but we did hear from testimony that there was a lot of effort and intention that went into setting the ratio that's there now. So all of that to say, I am still supportive of trying to find an amendment somewhere to this effect that works. If there's not other commissioner support for doing something like that, I would be in favor of maintaining the bird safe requirement as written and just getting rid of that, like that we would change that to be the amendment instead of this new option that we're creating.
Commissioner Thompson, a couple things. First off, on at least in the base zones, we've had to specifically measure where you calculate ground floor windows, and it's between 2 feet and 10 feet above grade, regardless of what the ground floor actually looks at. That works for the windows. It may not necessarily work for the other situations where we look at ground floors. The other piece I want to bring up, this was intended as a project in the kind of direction we've been getting from council. It's been a project to kind of reduce regulatory barriers. if we have a situation where we start requiring bird-safe glazing on a ground floor, and if the upper floors happen to actually be at 20% glazing, because that's quite possible, you might have a situation where the first 60 feet are at 30%, but we're still then with an amendment trying to put bird safe glazing on the ground floor, which is actually more restrictive than what we currently are doing. It's not I mean, the upper floors are not necessarily going to be under 30% or right at 30%. And what I heard was if the upper floor is under 30%, but the ground floor is at a higher percentage glazing, that ground floor would have to be bird
No,
safe.
I'm sorry. This is really complicated to explain, and I apologize if I'm doing a poor job. I'm just saying that if the ground floor glazing is in excess of 30%, then it should not penalize the entire facade. It should not penalize the upper floor residential. I'm not suggesting that that we would go in the other direction here. So I think that we're
So
still
maybe
not
I
quite-
could. I
You're nodding your head, Sandra. Do you?
I think this is maybe what you're saying. So correct me if I'm wrong. I think you're saying if the upper floors are 30% glazing or over, they should trigger bird safe glazing. So that could be one standard. If the ground floor is X percent glazing, it should trigger ground floor bird safe glazing, right? No, you're not saying that.
No, I'm just saying that like you're looking at the ground floor independently of the rest of the facade.
Okay.
So like let's just all
So let's-
picture a building. Like we're gonna picture a 4-story building that has 3 floors of residential and 1 ground floor of commercial.
Mhm.
The 3 floors of residential,
Mhm.
they all have a 30% window to wall ratio. So it's mostly a solid facade, and
Mhm.
then you've got smaller windows that are cut into that.
Mhm.
That portion of the facade, it would be able to avoid triggering bird safe glazing because it's at or below 30% window to wall
Great.
ratio.
So that's
And
one standard.
that's great. So then there's the ground floor, which
Mhm.
from an urban design standpoint, street activation,
Mhm.
we want some glass. We want to be able to see in, we want
Mhm.
transparency. We've got a project that comes in, they're proposing to make their ground floor 60% glazing. As the rule is currently written, they have to take that 60%
Yes.
and they have to add it to the glazing ratio and the floors up above and take that whole average. So now you're not at 30% window to wall ratio, you're
Right.
at 42% or whatever the number is. So you have to put
Right.
bird safe glazing everywhere up
Right.
to 60 feet. And what I'm saying is if you want to do that 60% ground floor, if it's above 30%, you still have to put bird safe glazing on it, but hold, as Eli put it, hold harmless the floors up above that are still maintaining 30%.
So
Why
you-
should you have to apply bird
So-
safe frit there or some other solution?
Can I just, so the net effect of that, Patricia Diefenhofer, for the record, is that every ground floor is likely to have to do bird safe glazing, right? That's effectively what you're saying, because the ground floor, we also have a minimum standard of 40% or 60%, depending on the situation, right? So I think what you're describing is an outcome in which bird safe glazing would have to be done on the ground floor in all cases. And then it's just a question of not triggering the upper floors.
Right, which is what the current code requires. So I think what Commissioner Thompson's proposal is that oftentimes the ground floor you would have to provide bird safe glazing, but you wouldn't also have to provide it for all floors above it, the residential floors above it. And under current code, I think that's what happens, is that that's your dynamic.
The current code is looking at the first 60 feet,
right?
Calculating that entire facade. If that entire facade is at 30%, meaning
So
if the ground floor is at 80% and all the upper floors are at 20%, but overall calculates at 30%, then 90% of the glaze, this gets into the details, but then basically almost all the glazing has to have bird safe treatment, including the upper floors and so on. Considering that our ground floor should always be over 30%, that's where I was trying to say we were kind of doubling down, because right now there's a lot of development where you might have 15 to 20% upper floor windows, especially for a residential development where you don't necessarily need as much openings. And you may do that, have your 80% glazing on the ground floor for commercial and or lobby spaces, fall under the 30% and not be subject to the bird safe glazing standard. If we calculate the two separately, you're going to always have bird safe glazing on the ground floor. And so that's a greater cost and a greater kind of review process than what we currently have. That obviously wasn't the direction we were given. So,
So, Chair O'Meara, for the record, I think our options here, and Vice Chair Thompson, looking to you for your preference. I heard an option we could take a 5-minute recess, and if you wanted to propose modifications to this amendment that better align with what your intention was, we could take a short recess and then reconvene and have that amendment potentially presented. Or we could not vote on the amendment and propose an amendment that would maintain the current bird safe glazing requirements and not make a modification via the housing regulatory relief package. Do you have a preference of either of those two options, Vice Chair Thompson?
My preferred approach would be to make a modified amendment that we remove the bird safe glazing forgiveness from the package altogether, and maybe recommend to council that another work group or focused look be given to modifications that reduce barriers. Because I'm just not sure that we're going to get there. I hear what Phil is saying. I don't want to go that what he's describing with the ground floor is not my intent. So that's where I'm at right now.
Okay. And Patricia, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just before we abandon completely, I just wanted to ask the question. So, and maybe I'm also sort of asking the question of staff a little bit just for guidance. What you're proposing, I was just thinking about what Phil said about not wanting to actually be more sort of restrictive in the event that the upper stories are actually lower transparency. It does, I think what we're working on does ultimately require still, I was going to say it requires looking at the ground floor and the upper floors separately, but in fact, I was trying to think of, it seems to me that you could still look at the 0 to 60 and determine what the overall percentage is. If the overall percentage happens to be 30% or lower, then great, it doesn't get triggered. If including the ground floor happens to trigger, exceed the 30%, then maybe we could write a provision that says if only the ground floor is triggering that, then only the ground floor has to be subject to the bird safe glazing requirement. Is that? I know it's starting to write more code and get complicated, but
can I jump in?
Yeah.
Because that's the amendment I was trying to write.
Yes.
And what I wrote was bird safe glass. It's not. I shared this with staff ahead, and I understand it's more complicated. But if bird safe glass is not required if the residential floors of buildings with 30% or less glazing until some date. So the floors that basically if the residential, this doesn't talk about the ground floor at all, and I don't think it needs to. And maybe this is a huddle with Shannon for 5 minutes, but. Basically, if a floor is 80% residential, I'll just make that up, and it meets the 30% threshold, then that floor doesn't have to have bird safe glazing, period.
I mean, keep in mind that the 0 to 60 feet, if somebody's calculating that, that might go halfway up a floor, right? We're not talking about, when we're doing that measurement under the current provision, we're not
So you
talking
do
about
the exact,
floors.
so I'm saying you would do the exact calculation you're used to doing, which maybe splits the floor, that's fine, and do that calculation, and it says, let's say you have to do bird safe glazing in the whole building. But then with this clause, you actually don't have to glaze the residential floors. So you do exactly the calculation you're used to doing, but since this project is about reducing regulations on residential projects, you basically say the residential floors, you don't have to do it, as long as they're 30%, which is the intent.
Yeah, and I mean earlier I was concerned about what is considered a residential floor, right? Because
I'm trying to guard for that by saying 80%. I think in practice, in multi-story Central City buildings, floors are all one, at least after the first floor, they're all like one use. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that you're unlikely to find like a mix of commercial and residential on the same floor. But just to guard against that possibility, you could say the floor has to make up some percentage residential so that you're actually getting the intent.
Another possibility is whether we said that there were residential uses in the first 60 feet, as opposed to just that the site has residential uses.
I think if we start to add percentages of, the space, the floor area as residential, then we're starting to have yet another calculation that has to be done. Chair O'Mara, if you're amenable, I think if we had maybe 5 minutes to just discuss really quickly, maybe we could come up with something. If we can't come up with something quickly, we'll reconvene and we'll move on from the topic.
Yeah, we have 1 hour left of the meeting with 2 additional amendments. So I think, we're about halfway through. So I think we can go ahead and take a 5-minute break and then reconvene and see if the proposed amendment, if we can reach more of a consensus on that.
Matt, I see Vice Chair Pouncel's
Vice
hand,
Chair
and I
Pouncil, go
thought
ahead.
Maybe we could hear from him first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to say that I appreciate Commissioner Thompson's thoughtful, suggestion to maybe we should just leave this and make an amendment and move forward. I feel as though that we don't have the science, we don't have, the rigor is not here for us to move forward on this. And I feel like we're not doing this code justice. And, we can take the 5-minute break, but I really don't feel comfortable about moving forward on this without the science and the rigor that it deserves.
Okay, I think, why don't we go ahead and do a quick straw poll just for me to do a temperature check. Around for commissioners, if we are to propose an amendment that just removes the consideration of the bird safe glazing from housing regulatory relief, essentially, we're not suggesting any modifications. We are going to make an amendment that we want consideration of any modification of bird safe glazing removed from HRR. Can I get just a show of hands of who would support that at this point? I'm trying to gauge if we should go ahead with the break and amendment, if commissioners feel that's worth our time, or are we at a place where there's support to just remove bird safe glazing from the HRR package? Okay, I see 3, I'm 5.
Are you saying remove bird safe from the package?
Retain the bird.
Retain the
regulation
current
as exists
requirements
currently.
as is. Okay, so again, I think the count here, is 5 to 3. So 3 are open to amendment. 5 would like to proceed with just retaining current requirements around bird.
Which is an amendment to retain the bird
Correct.
safe glazing requirement.
No, I'm in favor of the package as proposed to offer flexibility.
Okay, so we have a third option on the table.
I am too.
Okay, thank you for those clarifications.
Thank you.
So with that mixture, I think I will go ahead and ask for the 5-minute break. Sorry for the roller coaster here, but again, we've got not unanimous on the removal of the bird friendly. So I want to at least give staff the 5 minutes to draft a potential amendment and bring that back.
And the potential amendment would be to retain the bird safe glazing requirement. No, it's okay.
No, it's to address the modifications to try to better align with Vice Chair Thompson and Vice Chair Spivak's original intention for the amendment.
Is there support beyond just Eli and myself understanding? I couldn't see who exactly in the room was saying that they want to go with the original package as recommended, which would include the pause, the 5-year pause on bird safe for residential. But of the people that are interested in preserving some aspect of bird safe, is there interest from others in an amendment to create a modification?
I think we have to see the amendment.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because we do have two commissioners that would like to have the HRR passed as the original language for bird-friendly glazing. So we're split as a commission.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and reconvene at 2:41 and discuss proposed amendment. everyone for your patience in this process. I'm Chair Mary Reno Mera. This is the November 14th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting for the City of Portland. We are discussing the Housing Regulatory Relief Package, and we have proposed modifications to the amendment. Okay, I'll hand it over to Sandra Wood to see where we landed.
Thank you, Chair O'Mara. I think where we landed was we did a quick huddle, we brainstormed, and we don't feel comfortable proposing new language right now because it gets quite complicated. And when we bring an amendment to you, we usually check in with our implementing bureau also to make sure it's the simplest it can be to implement the intent of the commission. So I think at this point you have two choices, either to not propose an amendment to the proposed draft, or to propose an amendment to retain the bird safe glazing requirement as it is in the zoning code today.
Thank you, Sandra, and thanks again for the fast turnaround with that discussion. Vice Chair Thompson, turning it back to you, would you like to propose an amendment?
Thank you. Yes, I'll propose an amendment to retain the existing bird safe glazing requirement as it stands. And just want to also share appreciation for staff's efforts in trying to work through this. This has been a real brain teaser. And I think that there are improvements to be had, but that we just need a little bit more time and likely some other voices to identify what those should be. But thank you so much.
Okay, do we have a second to the amendment?
This is Vice Chair Pouncil. I will second the amendment.
Any discussion by commissioners? Okay, let's proceed to roll call.
Okay, Alexander. Aye. Lang.
No.
Patel.
No.
Pouncil.
Aye.
Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
I'm going to comment on this. I think that there is a middle ground. I hope we have time, the city, to find it between now and city council. I'll vote aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
O'Mara.
Aye. Okay, the amendment is approved. And we can now proceed to the next proposed amendments regarding eco roofs. And I'll go ahead and jump in because I was at least one of the co-sponsors here on this one, I think with Vice Chair Thompson. In reviewing the language, I wanted to clarify that really my intent here was that we would maintain the eco roof requirement as currently exists in zoning code, except for if a developer is proposing 50% of the roof area or more with solar PV infrastructure. And so I know that the way it's written actually says 100%, but then there's a reduction allowed for 40% of that roof area to be covered with additional mechanical, elevator, shaft, and other items as listed here. So essentially we're landing at a 60% PV requirement. So that is a little bit higher than what I was intending, and would be interested in other commissioners in terms of, is this presenting a new burden, or does a 60% PV requirement seem reasonable as a path for exemption to the eco roof requirement? Okay, not hearing other comments or questions, I could turn it back over to staff if you have a response or any follow-up questions to my comments there. Commissioner Lang?
Yeah, when this came to us, it was because we were trying to kind of kickstart some development for housing, and so can we pull some of those regulations that added extra burden to the development cost or timing or such by reducing eco roofs and replacing with solar? I don't think we're achieving that. I think it's more, this was presented as this is one way that a developer can get going on a project and perhaps save a little money on that development and maybe keep housing costs down at the same time. And I feel this just changes the burden, but the burden's still there. So.
Okay. Oh, staff. Commissioner Routh.
I'm inclined to agree. Commissioner Routh, for the record. I'm inclined to agree. I think in the original briefing, I heard Phil say that eco roofs is one way to manage stormwater, and that minus eco roofs, that stormwater management would have to happen in a different way, and so the the retention of eco roofs is a way of retaining stormwater plus those co-benefits. So I would be inclined to agree with that. Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair Thompson.
I am supportive of the way that staff had crafted the amendment as it pertains to solar, because I think that it was a pretty clean way of allowing that as a possibility in lieu of eco roof. So just back to your question, Chair O'Meara, about the 60 versus 50% requirement. I am supportive of the way that they've crafted that. I will agree that this did not really come up a lot in testimony. It's not something that is reducing barriers to housing. I think from my standpoint, it's more about while we're here, let's look at ways that we can incentivize climate smart development. And I think that allowing for a reasonable trade-off for eco roofs is fair. And I'm not very convinced that eco roofs are in and of themselves a barrier to development. I just want to remind commissioners that they were, I think, ranked 13th in order of importance on that developer survey that went out after many other things like system development charges and inclusionary housing and the active uses and many, many other things. And as we heard in the testimony, they do provide a lot of benefit beyond just stormwater management. Thank you.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefendorf for the record. So I just want to clarify that I think ultimately what this amendment is not about reducing cost or deregulating per se. It was just creating a different flexibility within the regulation. I think there always been some discussion around the fact that the eco roof requirement, didn't allow room for other things, for example, like the solar panels or the solar voltaic panels. So I think this is what it is. It's providing more flexibility, but it's not necessarily in the spirit of reducing cost. And it's just a question of whether the commission wants to support this amendment or, I guess, the alternative. So there's two alternatives, right? There's going with the proposal as staff recommended, which is to remove the requirement for that temporary time, or to just retain the requirement as it is today. So there's sort of three potential options on the table.
Thanks, Patricia. Commissioner Spivak?
Thank you. I agree that this is one of those cases like the birds where the question is where's our critical mass between either. My sense from straw polling earlier is that this commission probably was going to reject staff's recommendation to waive eco roofs entirely. So then the question is, if that's the case, is there a middle ground? And I think I kind of agree with Commissioner Thompson. This is sort of why we're at it. But I think this is a middle ground. I think that putting PV on a roof instead of a solar panel solar panels pay for themselves financially. And that is a benefit to the building, to the financial feasibility of the building. I know there's other benefits at play here too. So I think that allowing them as an option for the rooftop area expands ways to meet not the same environmental goal, but a different environmental goal, and maybe save some cost. So I like the amendment.
Thank you. Yeah, and just another motivation for this amendment was savings in cost to actual tenants. And as we see the cost of living and rents rise in our region, I do think that solar PV infrastructure, there are a lot of funding mechanisms to integrate this within development, and it provides long-term cost savings to either the building operator, which then is a benefit, or direct pass-through savings to the residents. of these new housing buildings. So I would like to go ahead and propose that the amendment as written go to vote.
Chair O'Meara, you do have one hand up.
Oh, I'm
online.
sorry.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Pouncil.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Council here. Yeah, I am a fan of solar voltaics, and yes, I would second what Commissioner Spivak said, that this is a benefit for the tenants or the folks in those buildings. I guess one of my concerns about this is, what are the stormwater treatment requirements for having photovoltaics. I don't know if there's, or I'm not recalling the discussion about that. We know that the eco roofs do provide stormwater treatments, and and I know that this is just a temporary change in this, but I do worry about the some of the efficacy of what we're kind of doing here too. Like, what are the impacts of this, and do they really support, I guess, the intent of doing this as well. I mean, does this really meet the original intent of the relief, the housing relief, proposal. So, but that's my comment.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pouncil. And I heard a question there. I'm not sure if Vice Chair Thompson, you were going to respond to the stormwater management as would be typically accommodated if there is not an eco roof installation. If not, we can certainly ask staff.
So,
Yeah, I mean, staff can speak to it as well, but the projects are still required to manage their stormwater on site. And there are different ways that projects can do that. They can use a dry well, or depending on the configuration of the site, you could do like stormwater planters at grade instead of on the building roof. I think for me, some of the issues with dry wells is that they don't provide all of the same benefits that a green roof does provide with regard to reducing urban heat island effect and habitat and things like that. But if there was an applicant that proposed to do solar at their roof instead of eco roof, they would still have to manage their stormwater on site through one of those other means.
I just want to iterate that is correct. Yeah. The stormwater regulations would still have to be complied with, and the applicants would have to do so in whatever fashion they're able to. And if that means using the roof, then they would choose that probably over the solar, or if they could do it elsewhere, they would do it elsewhere. So it comes back to the creating the flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Is there, I'm sorry, this is Commissioner Council again. Is there any savings? I mean, do we really, I mean, I heard Commissioner Lane talk about that this doesn't really, make any savings to the developer. And then, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember, another commissioner had also made that comment as well. I'm just, I just see this as kind of like, why are we changing this? This is like sort of a low man on the totem pole in a way, for things that actually need to be changed to actually produce, the more production of,
I think Commissioner Pouncil, I think, the spirit of it was we asked developers what was in the way of housing production. They identified this amongst other issues. And so I think, like you mentioned in the last meeting, this is kind of an experiment, right? For 5 years, the standard is pretty new anyway, but for 5 years, why don't we give developers as much flexibility as possible to develop as much as we can, since we're in the situation that we're in.
Yeah, if we have the science on our side, if we have the science there, I'm all for that experiment. Yeah, experimenting with, but I don't know if if like I said earlier, I don't know if the if the science is, I don't know if the science is really there. I don't know if the rigor is there to actually, and even the economic, would be there. The economic advantage would actually be there as well. But yeah, in the spirit, I totally understand that and I respect that. But I think I just, I think it's just important for us to kind of, I just think about the consequences of us making decisions like this without the rigor. That's my concern.
I think, once again, this is Phil Naimany. I think what you're going to see with this proposal as we've presented the amendment today is folks or developers who have an intention from the beginning to provide solar and want to incorporate that into their development will use this provision to not have to also ask for a modification, especially if they're going through design review, or ask for an adjustment. If it's somebody who's on the fence about it and they're still hit with either stormwater requirements or they're not sure that the solar is going to pencil out, they're going to just do the eco roof requirement. So the initial proposal that we had was kind of to provide ultimate flexibility, allow them to talk to BES, see what's the best idea. If it's a very intensive building, the eco roof may still be a better idea. If there's other sites where they can do stormwater planners, maybe that's what they would want to do. But with this proposal, I think it's kind of boiled it down to people who want to do solar will take advantage of it. We got rid of the requirement that they ask for a modification. Otherwise, they will just go ahead and do the eco roof.
Okay, and I think I saw Commissioner Routh. Did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, a question. Again, out of ignorance, are eco roofs and photovoltaics mutually exclusive on a roof? Like, can you?
You can do both.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what, for example, if one were to put solar above an eco roof, to what extent does that impact the stormwater benefit? Do you know what I mean?
You can still use the eco roof for stormwater. I think you have to be sensitive to how things are running off the photovoltaics. You have to look at plantings that maybe can handle more shade and things like that. We haven't had a lot of experience where people have done both. One of the modifications we looked at, or one of the projects, they actually did not give them the modification for solar because they said you could potentially do both on that. But the applicant decided to just do an eco roof instead. But from what I've heard, you can do both. A lot of it depends on, if the solar is only 18 inches above the eco roof, I don't know if that's going to be sufficient light for that. So there's probably some design elements to be able to accommodate both.
Okay, should I go ahead and read the amendment in order to advance it, or?
Sure, or you could just move, if you want to move the amendment, you could just say move amendment.
Okay,
number
I would
3.
like to move this amendment to vote.
Is there a second?
I second. This is Vice Chair Thompson.
Okay, any additional discussion by commissioners? All right. Roll call, please, Julie.
Alexander,
Aye.
Lang,
No.
Patel,
No.
Pouncil,
Vice Chair Pouncil, we didn't hear your response.
So sorry. No.
Routh,
No.
Spivak,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
O'Meara.
Aye.
So it's 4-4. Yeah. It is.
That's fine.
So it doesn't pass.
So the amendment doesn't pass.
Okay. So there is confirmation of a split vote.
Is that right?
4-4.
4-4, so that means that the amendment does not pass.
Correct. It
Okay.
fails. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, and so what that means is that we
So
either,
what's-
oh, go ahead.
Someone can put
Vice
another
Chair
amendment-
Thompson.
So someone can put in another amendment on the table. If
Yeah, I would like to put forth an amendment that we maintain the existing eco roof requirement without regard to the solar piece. Just maintain the existing requirement.
Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, any discussion by commissioners? Okay, Julie, roll call, please.
Alexander.
No.
Lang.
No.
Patel.
No.
Pouncil.
Yes.
Routh.
Yes.
Spivak.
No.
O'Meara.
Aye.
Is it split?
Sorry, Thompson.
Aye.
Okay, is that a split again?
It fails.
Sorry. Council voted no.
No, yeah, I think it's 4-4.
It's 4-4.
That's what I counted.
It is 4-4.
It's a split vote again.
Okay, confirmation of a split, so the amendment does not pass. Do we have yet another amendment, or do we proceed to, okay, Commissioner Lang?
I move we accept the original proposed draft from staff.
And you don't need to move that. You don't need an amendment for that.
That would be part of the package approval. Okay, well, we have one more amendment ahead of us, which is the neighborhood contact. And I proposed this contact with the intention of maintaining what I consider a pretty baseline requirement for developer and our architect information to be provided via a site posting. So the amendment is to have a requirement for a site posting for a proposed development. I believe the square footage is I'm trying to scroll down here quickly.
10,000
square feet or above. And the other neighborhood contact requirements as included in the housing regulatory relief package, I am not proposing an amendment to, just to require a site sign posting. Any discussion, comments, questions from other commissioners on this proposed amendment?
You need a second.
Oh, can I have a second, please, before we proceed to
I second
discussion?
Commissioner Routh.
Okay. Any discussion? Commissioner Patel?
Yeah. So I had a question on this. I was going through the code. Title 33 triggers a lot of neighborhood contact requirements. And one of the posting requirements is a 35-day period before submitting a land use review application or a building permit. And as I understand it, the initial package included the removal of the 35-day period.
The initial package removed the neighborhood contact requirement for
Not-
5 years entirely. So it just, you would never go to those provisions that say you have to send out a notice, you have to post it. All that was going to be waived for 5 years. So the 35-day aspect of it wasn't a factor because it wasn't actually getting invoked.
Okay, so the posting, or the 35-day requirement applies to the criteria for the posting requirement. So that was not in consideration at all from the initial package, correct?
Correct.
Correct. The,
So
the
the
neighborhood
amendment, what would
contact
be
has
the
actually 3
net
elements
effect?
to it. It has, essentially it has the notification that you send via email, information in 35 or more days about your application for a land use review or permit. It then has a posting, and then it has giving information to BDS so that they can do their stuff online. If it triggers the neighborhood contact 2 provision, then there's also the requirement to have the meeting. our original amendment or proposal was to essentially not have any of those things get triggered. With Chair O'Mara's request to kind of go back to the posting, once again, rather than trying to rewrite a new version of this, we said, okay, we'll go back to the neighborhood contact one option, which is essentially includes just the posting and the notification and letting BDS know. But by going back to that code provision, it's written currently that you have to do it at least 35 days before the application.
Okay.
So the net effect of the change would be to just the timing of when you have to do it wouldn't change. It would just be that you would now be required to do the posting and the notification, but the public meeting would never be triggered.
Right.
In this intervening time.
But previously the 35-day period was removed entirely. No.
With our proposal?
Yeah, with
yes,
your proposal.
it was removed
the entire
entirely.
section of the posting was removed.
The entire
neighborhood
notification
contact.
process. The whole chapter essentially was waived.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you for that question and clarification. I still would like to proceed with the amendment. I think that the 35 days, as developers are typically acquiring sites well above the land use process, does not present unsurmountable boundaries, and I consider it a pretty minimum threshold to notify of a upcoming site development. So I would like to move with the amendment if there are no further question or discussion. Okay.
Alexander.
Do we need a second?
Do we need a second?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay,
There's-
great.
I think it's been seconded. Yeah.
Can I have a discussion item? I'll just say in practice,
ahead.
staff shared, I think that if people forgot to make the notification, they've accepted that after the application was done with intake. Wisely or not, it seems like that was been a process.
I think it was something, and it's something I think with permits, and it was a COVID issue that just hasn't been dropped off. I believe if somebody's what I got from BDS the last couple of days was if there's a land use review, they will bounce it back. So, and the code says that basically it's not accepted until they've gone through that process. What we felt was kind of getting at the 35-day piece is it doesn't mean that the project's stopped, because all you need to present is a pretty brief proposal about what you're presenting. 3-story building, 35 units or whatever, and a site plan. And usually, you can probably generate a site plan where you're still working on engineering drawings and things like that. So that's why we didn't consider trying to further manipulate the 35-day piece.
Chair O'Mara, before we vote, I'm going to, Mike Alexander for the record, can we restate the amendment? We've kind of gone back and forth. I want to make sure I'm clear on what I'm being asked.
Yes, let me scroll up. So the amendment maintains the posting requirement of the neighborhood contact provisions while suspending the meeting requirement for 5 years. The intent is still to provide project and contact information ahead of a permit or land use review without requiring the commitment for having a meeting. The staff proposal to permanently simplify the neighborhood contact options remain. The change shifts the temporary suspension language from the base zones to the administrative chapter 33.705, and a narrative is provided below.
Right, thank you.
Okay.
Aye.
Thanks. Lang.
Aye.
Patel.
No.
Pouncil.
Vice Chair Pouncil, you are on mute.
No.
Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
O'Mara.
Aye. Okay, I think we passed that one. Thank you all for the presentation of the package of these amendments.
I've got a motion.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about
We have
this.
another motion from
on
Commissioner
the-
Spivak.
Sorry about this, but given how we landed with 2 tie votes on the eco roofs, such that the default is removing the eco roof requirement entirely, as which is what the current baseline is.
To amend the proposed draft to retain the eco roof requirement.
No, I think as I understand
Yes,
it, what we're
yes,
about
you're
to
right.
vote on would
Yes.
remove the eco roof requirement entirely for 5
Yes.
years. So in that context, I'd like to reoffer the amendment the staff supported of saying that the eco roof amendment number 3, which allows us to provide an alternate way of meeting the requirement with PV on the roof.
I second that amendment.
Commissioner Spivak, can you provide a bit more clarification? Is this
I'm basically reoffering the same amendment now that we know what the default is.
okay?
But basically,
okay.
the situation
so
is
a
is-
revote essentially
I'm going to revote on that
after
one,
a
yes.
clarification. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Other discussion before we proceed to roll call. And again, the amendment as proposed is to retain the current eco roof requirements
With the option for PV. that
with
you
the option
introduced.
for PV.
Correct.
Correct.
To clarify for the record, Patricia Diefendorfer, as written in the
As written in the
memo.
packet that was shared
In
with
the-
us for the
yeah.
meeting, yes. Thanks.
Okay. Alexander,
Aye.
Lang,
No.
Patel,
No.
Council,
Aye.
Routh,
Aye.
Spivak,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
O'Meara.
Aye. Okay, the amendment is approved.
Phew.
Okay, any additional motions or amendments before we move on to the package overall? Okay. I will turn it back to Sandra and Phil just to talk us through the next steps.
Yeah, so your last page has the next step, which is for you, someone to move to adopt the proposed draft as amended today and amend Title 33 Planning and Zoning as reflected in the proposed draft as amended today. So we need a
Okay. I move that we adopt the proposed draft as amended in the memo and amend Title 33, Planning and Zoning as reflected in the proposed draft as amended per today's discussion. Is there a second?
Yes, I'll second that.
Okay, discussion.
Okay. Alexander,
Aye.
Lang,
No.
Patel,
Say aye with a comment of saying that although my viewpoint from other amendments that were proposed didn't go through, the entirety of this package I think is wonderful. It's reflective of the staff's hard work and the responsiveness that they had to the development community for a crisis that we all know of. So as a symbolic gesture to the package at hand, I'd like to vote yes.
Council,
Yes.
Routh,
Yes.
Spivak,
I'll make a comment that I'll be voting yes. But I appreciate that this is the first time we've had a commission decision on a project where we had split votes and we had to sort things out. And so thanks to fellow commissioners for working through that process on a tight timeline, which we usually don't have, and to all the public who gave input on this. I'm sure this will leave many people unhappy, but maybe that's the way it's inevitably going to be. And City Council will wrestle with this after we're done with the recommendation. Thanks.
Thompson,
Yes.
O'Meara.
Aye. Okay, the motion is approved. And I would just like to comment, I think that there will be a lot of happy developers and people trying to advance housing under this regulatory relief package. I think that out of the multi-page relief package presented, which did require extensive work, and appreciate that by staff, in addition to extensive testimony that we've received, that to have just a handful of amendments with really healthy debate and some split votes, I consider a success. So thank you everyone for your participation. And I think the last item of business today is just a short discussion of points for the Planning Commission letter to Council on the housing regulatory relief.
Yeah. So Commissioners, Patricia Diefenhofer for the record. Yes, we would appreciate your guidance in writing up the transmittal letter, letting us know what points you want to elevate. Obviously, the transmittal letter will reflect the vote, which is that the commission voted to approve this package and recommend that City Council approve the package. And I want to just maybe offer that I heard Commissioner Spivak say that you were potentially interested in maybe seeing if there could be an amendment to the bird safe glazing that could work and be in the spirit of what was discussed here. I don't know if you want to express that or follow up on that. That might be something that we could continue to look at between now and council. So I just want to put that out there.
I think I would maybe call attention to our split 4-4 vote on that topic, that it was perhaps influenced by difference of opinions, but also by lack of time to come up with something that would get more of a majority. And there's some science involved in this that we didn't have enough time to figure out in 2 weeks. I guess another item we might put in the letter is calling attention to conditional use reviews and how that's making it harder for faith-owned properties and nonprofits that have a lot of parking to get rid of it. And that was not part of this project scope. Staff convinced us to not trying to introduce it in there, but it's happened a couple times in the past 2 years where they've had to go through conditional uses to do it, and predictably it's going to keep happening in the future until this code section gets attended to. So I understand it's a tight knot with different sections, but I think that we've done a lot on parking, but that is a current impediment to repurposing a lot of large lots in the city. Thanks.
Chair O'Meara, for the record, I would like to have mention in the letter of, even if high level, what is the monitoring that will occur over the next 5 years to the changes that have been made or will be made as part of this package? What will be review opportunity by Planning Commission? How will we know essentially at the end of 5 years that these measures either are successful and have significantly alleviated burdens to housing development, or maybe the reverse or opposite of that is that unintended consequences, right, of these measures. So in the letter, I would like to have mention of what staff is thinking about the 5-year process and how will be provided information and opportunity at the end of those 5 years to either go back to the original zoning code or maintain changes that have been made.
Can I change that a little bit, because this letter is your letter to City Council, so it's odd for us to put in an answer there. Maybe we could reframe it to the Planning Commission suggests that City Council asks staff to develop a monitoring plan to ensure that development that occurs within the next 5 years is looked at or something.
Yeah, I agree with that. I am also interested in what that is. So I would also like, not part of the letter necessarily, but would like to recommend that come back to Planning Commission around once a monitoring plan is developed, if we could have an update on what the intent is.
Commissioner Pouncil here too. I was also wanting to make sure that once the 5-year, this temporary is up, that it goes back, that we know for sure, guarantee that it goes back to the original code, and that that we can just go back to the original code that was written, and that that is a solid
That is
know.
a solid, Commissioner Pouncil, because that's the way we've structured the code. So if you look at the code language, it says permits on land use reviews submitted before such date. So even if that date comes and goes, permits after that time won't be able to utilize these reliefs.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to call attention to the bike parking piece as a specific follow-up item, because we included the 100% of staff recommendation on it with a recognition that it's just going to take more time than we have here. So I would like to ask City Council to commit to looking at that section of the code without waiting 5 years, like sooner. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Alexander?
Yeah, and Mike Alexander for the record. I do understand the need for clarity of us going back to sort of this pre-revision standards. But I am also curious, we've reached out to developers to ask what barriers they believe are inhibiting optimal engagement on their part. I'd love to go back after some period of this 5-year period and ask how effective these were. Did it make a difference? Or, did we kid ourselves, or are we looking past solutions to continue to admire problems? So I hope that there's an opportunity to sort of re-gauge that, because I think the greatest clarity is at the greatest point of distress and pain, and they will be able to give us that.
Patricia Diefender for the record. Commissioner Alexander, I think that is kind of consistent with the idea that we sort of do some monitoring and evaluate how these provisions, like what the outcomes of these provisions are. So I think that's in line. What you're suggesting is in line with that. I think you're specifically suggesting that we kind of touch base again with the development community where some of these ideas originated and ask them to weigh in on how effective these provisions have been. And that's certainly one way to understand, how they've worked, how these regulations, these interim regulations are working, as well as just kind of monitoring how development, what is happening on the development front. Is development occurring, So I think it's all part of the kind of idea that we want to understand the outcomes of these temporary changes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lang?
Thank you. Will the letter speak to the split votes on some of these amendments as well?
I have that same question.
I can request
our
that.
practice. Yeah, let's talk about that. I think our practice is to we can certainly represent that there were people who there was not agreement. There was not total agreement.
Well, our usual practice, and just to refresh everyone's memory, is to say what the final vote was. So in this case, we would say 8 commissioners. It was a 7-1 final vote. And usually you would express here on the dais, Commissioner Lang, since you were the dissenting vote, if you wanted something included in the letter about what that dissenting vote is. That way, when Chair O'Mara is at City Council, she can adequately represent the full commission, both dissenting and the predominant vote. We don't usually go into each of the topics and say in this case and in that case. I mean, we can always make exceptions, of course. And I think I heard the notion that the bird safe glazing and explaining the 4-4 vote on that particular topic was important for the letter. I would say we would want to use that probably judiciously. Like how much detail about each of the votes.
I think another option would be to just reflect in the letter what were the, couple of points of debate. And because I think those can be pulled forward of real importance in terms of we did consider these items very seriously. And while overall we have approved the package, just calling forth the couple of items that we had split vote as, we heard testimony and we had debate, and the result was that
probably the
really
bird safe glazing and the eco roof.
Yes.
Would be the 2 prominent ones.
I would think so. Commissioner Routh?
I guess I think, especially since we have had a shorter period of time to deliberate on this package than we have on, and we are, I'm sure, hopefully likely to in future, that this might be an opportunity. And I will just say, Commissioner Lang, if you had specifically almost like a minority report, I feel given our truncated debate here, that might be appropriate. So I'm curious if you had anything to add.
I think the way you're going to format the letter gets to, my no vote was in recognition of why it was brought to us in the first place, and that was really it. I really appreciate the amendments. I thought they were well thought out, and I think they do offer a good compromise. My no vote was primarily because I wanted to stick to the spirit of what we were trying to obtain from the beginning. So I don't think a minority report would kind of build on that any more than that. So I think just identifying that it was a struggle, we added an extra meeting so that we could debate these amendments and figure out what made sense, I think is important for City Council to understand. But at the end, I'm on board as much as everybody that this is a good package, and look forward to seeing it work. So.
Okay, any final additional comments or considerations for the letter to City Council? All right.
I think that gives us a lot of direction. Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Patel, for the record, starting to think about this, I want to piggyback what Commissioner Lang initially said. I think just a brief reference of the amendments and then a table of yays and nays, just to show of how these amendments turned out, especially on my side. I went and said no on certain amendments that were thoughtfully proposed, but I initially agreed with the package. But I think it's more illustrative of also with the description, but also with maybe a table outlining, the yays and nays of each amendment without going into finer detail, if that makes sense.
I'm afraid we'll have to go into finer detail if we do that, because some of the amendments failed, so then we'd have to describe what the amendment is. So I guess I would encourage us to think this is a letter to City Council. We probably want to keep it at 2 pages and not spend so much real estate on the dissenting opinions and the back and forth. We want to probably at the beginning say why this is a good package and why we support the good, because that's the vote, right? It's 7-1 of supporting the package as a whole. So we want to spend some real estate on the page on that. Commissioner Spivak has
one idea. I'm inclined to not put that much detail in the letter. We could share with council the minutes from this meeting, just because that will have that level of detail in it. And that way, if council members want to sort of pull into their debate what we talked at the meeting, they'll have that without having to reproduce it in our letter.
Okay.
Yeah, Commissioner Pouncil here. I would second what Commissioner Spivak has said. I think that those minutes would also add a lot of nuance as well, which I don't think the council has a lot of time to really delve into like we've been able to.
Okay, just to summarize that recommendation, I'm hearing essentially an addendum or an attachment to the letter that just references the minutes for council members who choose to read through that detail. Go ahead, Julie. Did you have a comment?
I think Julie was suggesting that we could put a link in the letter to the minutes.
Okay.
I mean, so I think that let us take a stab at crafting. I think there's a way to just to characterize that there were a couple of issues that were carefully debated, and there was different opinions on a couple of issues, but overall the project was approved. I mean, so if that sounds amenable to everyone, we'll take a first draft of that and circulate it as we do, and look for your edits and input on that.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Alexander, did you have another comment?
Mike Alexander for the record. And again, I just wanted to to co-sign on the recommendation that the minutes be attached for both meetings. I mean, we had a broad range of public testimony. I would not want council to think that the 7-1 vote was just, I mean, this was a cage match in some ways, and I think it's important for them to understand the breadth and depth of community engagement and, quite frankly, perspective on this. So, I mean, the minutes, I don't think the letter has to reflect it, but I think just the limit on public testimony would give council a sense that this is something that it was an authentic engagement and discussion.
And Chair O'Meara, for the record, I think the letter can reference the amount of testimony we received, both written and in person, and just a quick reference to there was significant interest in this package, and maybe even some reference to the types of affordable housing, environmental interests, sort of just the types of interests that we heard from during testimony.
Commissioners, Patricia Diefendorfer, for the record, also know that in the presentation to council, we often do a high-level overview of the public outreach process and the input that was received. So that information will get conveyed to them.
And that gets included in the recommended draft as part of the public engagement section anyway, and in all the findings. So, and in the impacts report, I think we repeat it 5 times if we can include your letter.
Quick question, Wade Lang for the record. We will have opportunity to approve the minutes prior to it going to City Council, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
We'll have time to do that. Because Julie does the minutes so in a timely fashion. Thank you, Julie.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for the participation today. Thank you again to staff, Phil and Sandra. I know this has been a whirlwind to pull the package together, so appreciate everything you've done. Julie, Patricia as well. So I will adjourn us today for the Planning Commission November 14th, 2023 meeting. Thank you all.